Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Today we are talking all things hypermobility. It's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, and from my perspective, I've seen it cause a lot of issues for a lot of people. So we're going to do a little deep dive into that to discuss whether you might be hypermobile, what the common issues facing hypermobile people are, and what you can do about it. But before we get into it, a big thank you to our sponsor, Wit Fitness. Check out the store in One New Change, St. Paul's, or the website at wit-fitness.com and use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. We've had a few messages from some unhappy listeners saying the code didn't work, but we've looked into it and it's all sorted now. So if you did have that, I'm sorry for the frustration, but it should all be working now, and do let us know if it is not. But hypermobility. Hi, Rob.
Hi.
Just checking you're not sleeping on me, mate.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it.
Well, it's something which I've not had loads of experience with, to be honest with you, through my PT career, and I've definitely had a couple of clients which I've been able to say help through it. So I've obviously done my due diligence and research while I've been with them to help. But it's definitely something which I find really interesting, because hypermobility, unless you kind of say no that you've given it this name, sometimes it's just essentially really good range of motion. And I think this is, it's like, I know when I've seen, say, Gus, previous show guest, when he's done, say, snatches, and he'll be in the bottom of a snatch with his, like, this beautiful position, but then he'll struggle to get out at the bottom because he's got such a good bottom position where there's no actual tension. So it's funny that we look at hypermobility without the word hypermobility and just think, oh, that guy or girl has got great mobility, but is it any good? And I think this would be really good for, especially for the listeners and myself, to kind of know a little bit more in depth about, especially because this is your forte. This is what you do. You see people with all these kind of silent killers, shall we say? so let's kind of break it down. What is hypermobility, and how do people know if they kind of maybe have it?
Yeah, so it's very vague in terms of the definitions out there for hypermobility. There's no set point for when somebody goes from just being mobile to being actually hypermobile. There are a few tests out there in terms of like overextending your elbows, or if you can pull your thumb back towards your forearm. Anyone who can do that probably already knows, or their fingers just bend back miles.
I wonder who's just done that just now, because I just done my thumb. It's like, does it touch?
Yeah.
No, not really.
Yeah, exactly. So those are good indicators that you do have more pliable connective tissue, and you can be predisposed to hypermobility. There is actually some research linking it to anxiety. So the hormonal effects of anxiety can give you more range of motion and can be a problem, which is very interesting. But yeah, I've not got too deep into that just yet. But essentially, it's an unusually large range of motion, and this can be generally through the whole body, or it can be specifically in one joint or muscle. And I think flexibility is glamorized in the fitness industry as a really desirable trait, and there's also this notion that the more flexible you are, the less likely you are to get injured, which just isn't backed up really in the research or in anecdotal experience. I think it's perpetuated by things like Ryan Yoga doing yoga for football, because he was an old player and he had a long career, and he attributed it down to doing yoga and stretching. People draw this connection between having more flexibility means less injuries. And the unfortunate truth is that it is more nuanced than that. Having good range of motion can be a really good thing, but it can also be a problem. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. I think one aspect of hypermobility that's important to understand is that if you are hypermobile somewhere, you are quite often hypomobile somewhere else. So that means if part of your body is really flexible, then quite often a neighboring part of the body will be very stiff to compensate for that excessive or uncontrolled motion. And this is one of the ways that hypermobility can sort of bite you in the arse. The most common one I see here is if somebody's very loose or unstable in the hips, the lower back then takes the brunt of it. Like, and if your, say, hamstrings are super flexible and you continue to stretch them in a counterproductive way, and they become even more flexible or even less active and provide less and less tension, then the workload that they should be doing goes into one of its nearest neighbors, quite commonly the back. And this is very typical in people who get back pain when deadlifting. The hamstrings just aren't contributing at all. So stretching them off and deactivating them, for want of a better word, can actually hurt your back, even though people love the idea of loose or flexible hamstrings, which, yeah.
I think it's one of those type of, everyone thinks, oh, I have tight hamstrings. Well, no, that's a lie. Not everyone thinks that. But as you said, it's a really common thing to be said, right, oh, my hamstrings are really tight, so I have a really bad back because of it. And so, because a lot of the time people are seated and stuff like that. And it's I know I've had it with clients as well. It's sometimes people don't realize that their range of motion in their hamstrings is actually a lot less than they think, because when you're actually recruiting your hamstrings properly, and I think really good exercise, which I know we're both fan of, it's like Romanian deadlifts, where we're focusing on just the hinge portion of the deadlift, and you feel your hamstrings tighten up, and sometimes that hinge is very minimal, but that's where your hamstring range of motion is. And if you're going lower than that, then you have to ask, then is it now your hamstrings still doing the work, or is it now your back just essentially bending? And a big thing I think when it comes to, as you'll probably agree as well, is with hypermobility, is then being able to stabilize the joint and like then recruit the muscle necessary to do the work. And so it's a lot more, I think, when you're going through, say, a squat or say a deadlift, keeping on the deadlift, is in making sure we are loading, finding tension before we lift, and all these cues that you might need to think a little bit more about to make sure that you're not just going through the movement what you think looks right rather than actually what's right.
Exactly. And I think we talked about it in episode 10 when we talked about mobility versus stability, but there is a distinction between flexibility and what most people mean by mobility, which is whether that range is active or not. So if you anesthetize somebody, they're unconscious, most people could get their knee to their nose because all the muscles are relaxed and nothing is preventing them from flexing that much. However, when you're awake, the brain will activate muscles and create tone, which limits the range of motion. And that is what's causing the range to stop, not physical shortness in the muscle. So if you can't touch your toes, it's not because your hamstrings aren't actually long enough. It's because your brain is putting the brakes on and it's stopping you going any further. And one of the funny things that I've just thought about is when a lot of these people who say they've got tight hamstrings come in, that's just the feeling of tightness. But I've had so many people come in to complain about tight hamstrings, but they can straight-legged put their palms on the floor in a forward fold. And it's like, well, they're not tight. Like, they're objectively not tight here. You've got so much range, but it's a feeling of tightness that is almost, it is misleading. And the fact that they're so supple in those hamstrings can cause more issues. So if we bring it back to that deadlift example again, which I think is great for illustrating this point, they're not getting any tension from their hamstrings until they've got their palms on the floor, and maybe not even then. So in a deadlift where there's less hip flexion, they might not get any hamstring tension whatsoever to help them in that movement. So they need to learn the skill of finding their hamstrings in the range of motion that's relevant to the movement, which can be tricky and is actually harder to achieve than stretching someone who's tight. Like if somebody's too tight in their hamstrings and we want to just create more range of motion, but the hamstrings are active, stretching them out to develop that using something like an RDL is usually faster to achieve than creating tension in somebody who has huge ranges of motions that they need to rein in. So it's, I think given I see a lot of people who are injured, more of them present as hypermobile than hypomobile or stiff, which I think surprises a lot of people.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I know we've discussed it in previous episodes as well, but I think when we spoke about like with the wall ball as an example, and we said like, so when you're dropping to the bottom of a wall ball and you're quite tight in that lower end range, you're going to have a lot more of a spring effect anyway to get the next rep. So if anything, being a bit tighter. So going back right to the start when we were mentioning Gus with the ankles, in like if I have less range of motion than Gus does in my ankles, my bottom position is going to be a lot tighter, a lot sooner. So I'll be able to spring out of it a lot easier. Yes, he might be able to do more, but that's then more experience and just his cardio system. But as in like with me, as in like, I can get out of that so much easier with less work.
Yeah.
So then if I can harness that over time, it's not a bad place to be. And we said, I think in that episode as well, it's like, what's your function? Like, what do you need to do? What's the task at hand? And do you need to be super mobile, super flexible? At what part in the spectrum are you to know that that's what you need to be? Because if you, especially when you're doing a sport, say like CrossFit as an example, where the demand is so large across the body, you have to be able to correct total body tension so much of the time. And if you're hypermobile in particular areas, that may be an extra thought, an extra process that you really need to say nail down. I think it'd be really good to maybe get some examples and maybe because it's kind of hard to maybe self-diagnose. As you said, someone coming in trying to touch the floor and say, "Oh, I've got tight hamstrings," and they can palm on the floor. Clearly doesn't. So it can be quite a tricky thing to self-diagnose. So maybe if we work through the lower body and upper body and maybe a total body, because I know there's some quite common things. So we've discussed ankles and maybe calves. So let's start with the lower body. What would maybe something that you commonly see, and maybe what would be a fix that you could maybe take away from? I know obviously we're going to want to put a caveat, it is very independent, but like bird's eye, what do you think?
Yeah. So yeah, that is a big caveat that everyone's body is different. So these are common patterns, but that's not to say that this is exactly what's going on for you listening now. I think the hamstrings in the deadlift is a common one. And I actually had a client yesterday with hypermobile calves. So they have huge range of motion in dorsiflexion. Like the knee goes way beyond the toe in a squat or even a lunge. And they're actually experiencing knee pain because that anterior knee translation, the shooting forwards of the knee, was uncontrolled. So when they're bottoming out, catching in weightlifting or doing pistols, there's nothing putting the brakes on. So the bones end up, like really aggressive knee flexion. And the only thing that's stopping the knee flexing further becomes the ligaments. So what you really want in any joint is muscles to control the joint changing angle, and the ligaments are there as a last resort because they are not reactive. They're basically fixed length bits of seat belt that stop the bones ripping apart completely. But ideally, the muscles will create tension to decelerate you going into an end range before the ligaments are needed. And if you're only getting your ligaments, then over time, that's where more serious ligament injuries can occur, which is another reason why hypermobile people can have more severe injuries than stiffer people, because the stiffer people can pull a muscle easily, but they might not snap a joint, for example. So the game there, if the ankle is hypermobile, is how can we teach it to create tension sooner before we get those bones banging together at end range? And I can't remember which podcast it was, one of the early ones we talked to, maybe the knee valgus one. Muscles have to lengthen before they can shorten. Think of them as rubber bands. So they need to store some energy before they can then contract. So if we want that calf to contract, we have to stretch it first. And so that's why the joints are moving like they are, is they're looking for that tension, trying to get the stretch reflex, but because they're so flexible, they're not getting it in the range relevant to that movement. So we need to stretch that calf even more to teach it to fire, to then give it a chance of firing sooner in a shortened range. So tweaks we could make to the exercise would be to pre-fatigue the calf with calf raises, because if we go into deep dorsiflexion on a calf raise, we can get a greater stretch through either like gastrocnemius, or we can do a toes elevated version of the squat, which is unusual. Most people elevate their heels because they lack dorsiflexion, but here we're actually trying to exaggerate the stretch through the calf. So lifting the toes will stretch the calf relatively sooner compared to a flat-footed squat, and also relatively sooner compared to the other muscles in the lower body reaching their stretch point before the bottom position. So they will find that their squat depth is limited, which is good. That's what we want for this person, because it's when they bottom out, they are experiencing their issues.
Yeah, so I really like that drill. I say with the, especially what pre-fatiguing is like. I'm a big fan of that, especially within strength training in general. And but then going into using it in like this specific, in this side of it, and having the toes elevated. I think that having them on, like say the wedge. Would you do it double foot, or would you go single leg, more like a split squat?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, both.
Just because I'm trying to picture myself doing now a double-footed squat with my toes elevated, like how hard that would be for me. Obviously, where I don't have that range, I just can't imagine myself getting down there. But what I do find really interesting is that range of motion is, if you're picturing it now with your foot, say, on a wedge, so toes going towards the ceiling, and you're coming down, that your end range, or that person's end range of, say, that split squat or whatever squat, will probably look like a normal person's squat, but they've obviously had to raise their toe up to get that point, which just means they can decelerate the load, they can get there safely, rather than having their feet flat on the floor and having their knees to go so far forward where they then don't even get that end range, because they've got that much more, and then it's like physically impossible for their body to kind of get into that position. So it's a fascinating thought, because this is when I guess words like rehab like would come in, because people say, oh, that's rehab, even though that's not that's training, because it's just it's just different to what someone else is doing, and that's just specific training that is for this one particular person to make sure that they get this particular recruitment. Just because it's different to, say, it's like 80% of people doing squats, say, what's the difference? It's just because he's raising his toes up. It's just like when someone wears lifters raising their heel up. It's exactly the same thing, but they're doing something that looks different. So people put that word rehab in front of it, or prehab, and it's just like, whoa.
It's all training.
Yeah, exactly. And then, but that's, I think, the shift in mentality, and it's just like, just because it doesn't look like, say, 80% of people, do you want to be like 80% of people? No, you're an individual butterfly. You do you. So I think they're really good points, and I think obviously where we mentioned earlier is in with the ankle as well. So when we touched on, say, Gus, bottom of the snatch as an example. So even though it looks good on paper or in a photograph, seeing that picture, you'd look at that and think, great. Same as Sonny Webster has similar, wasn't he? He has extremely like mobile ankles, doesn't he? He doesn't even really need lifters. Like,
well, it is useful to have a big range of motion in weightlifting, because you can catch the bar lower, so you don't need to pull it as high. But it's only when it's too much that it's too much. So there's nothing wrong with having a big amount of dorsiflexion. Only if it's uncontrolled is that an issue. So this is why it can be confusing, and there's no people always want just black and white. This is always the case, but having flexible ankles is not a problem. For some sports and some movements it's good, for some movements and sports it's bad, and if it's uncontrolled it's almost always bad. But understanding the context with which you're evaluating a hypermobility is everything, because in certain scenarios, having those, well, this is what we're talking about offline before we started recording, having those hypermobile or very mobile ankles is great, because you can sit in the bottom of a squat all day and it is a rest position for you. So if that's something that makes your life easier to have that option, then that is adaptive and that is a useful thing to have. But when you bring that same mobility into weightlifting, when you don't have enough tension through the calf to decelerate the dorsiflexion, then it's a problem. So you can't evaluate it fully without knowing what you're evaluating it against. And it's the same thing we keep coming up against, but it applies in so many different contexts itself in fitness, like, what are you evaluating and why? What's the person need it for? And depending on all those variables will change the answer.
Yeah.
So having a little bit of a deeper understanding of what the qualities you're looking at are for makes the decision making process easier as to whether it's an issue and then how to address the issue.
I think you're right there. As in, we just all want to be black and white. We want to be straight to the point. Like, okay, if it needs to look like X, I'll be fine. And it's like, well, you have to ask more. And but I think we all get to that point once we kind of either stop progressing in a certain lift, or we start getting injured a bit more, or things start to come up which stop us going in that linear path that we thought we could go on. And most people will go there. And then it's only when that happens that, okay, cool, I now need to take a step back and then maybe ask these questions or find out reasons why these things might be happening. So there's nothing wrong if you are currently just YOLOing it with your training and just see what happens. But when you do start to come up with, say, maybe some injuries that keep happening, even though you keep like stretching or strengthening in a certain area, then maybe you need to come and get a diagnosis from a professional like Ash. So let's move on to the upper body, because I think since we've been mentioning the snatch, so having weights overhead, I think if you've got hypermobile joints, especially at the elbows, I think it's something which people will definitely see, that if someone's in a snatch and they essentially see their elbow on the other side of their arm, it really, it makes you feel really funny. But as in, like, having that for me, when I think about weight overhead, is you got to look at the first break point. It's in the same as really, we're going to say a squat anyway, but when you're overhead, looking at where that weight is and then loading to. And if your elbow is the first place, you just like, I can just picture this snapping, and it's just because naturally, it's like, you just think of so. But then, you just think of like MMA and stuff like that, where you've seen videos. So, but when we're overhead in these positions, obviously, say with a snatch or a strict press, that loading wants to be through essentially like the shoulder joint into the lats, the pec, like being stabilized by that sort of area. But if your weight is being stabilized by your elbow, essentially, then there's going to be some big issues there. So, what are maybe some of the things that you might diagnose with that you might try to help people improve that overhead position?
Elbows, well, hyperextended elbows give me the heebie-jeebies. It's just like it looks so worrying, and it's a tricky one because structurally, in say a jerk or anything where you're locked out overhead, you want to use your skeleton to its maximum. Like when everything's aligned is when the force is distributed best, and you have to do the least muscular work. Whereas if your elbow's bent, then obviously your triceps will be loaded if you're pressing something overhead. So having a good lookout is beneficial for the intent of lifting maximal weight overhead, which makes it difficult for somebody who's hypermobile because they only hit the end range when they have overextended the elbow. So then they're adding in a kink into the arm the other way. So it's very difficult for them. And I don't think it's reasonably practical to teach them to consciously keep their elbow at 180 degrees because they have to lock out hard and fast. And if there's nothing stopping them going beyond in the actual joint itself, then that's just where they find their end position. So from that consideration, the best thing is actually just conditioning that elbow to deal with the load, progressive overload, increasing the structural integrity of that joint to withstand those sorts of forces, and just not doing too much too soon. Like, real boring, simple answer. But the other component of overhead stuff, either pressing or more snatching, especially if somebody's got a very loopy bar path, the bar comes from out in front and it swings to behind. And if they don't have enough tension in the shoulders, they will just lose the bar behind. And you'll know this if this is you, that you get the bar up and overhead, but you can't stop it and balance it in that position. So how do you address that? You want to understand which muscles are not providing the tension that should be putting the brakes on and stopping it go beyond your center of mass. And usual suspects would be pecs and lats for decelerating that bar. And then it's the same process as we had for the calves in terms of making sure that those muscles can activate in those ranges of motion, and then learning the skill of activating them in the range that matters. So bar over the middle of your body versus waiting till the bar's behind you before they fire up. And that is why weightlifting is such a skill, because it's such a fine margin for if the bar goes slightly behind you and you need it to go slightly behind you before you catch it and balance it, then that from a physics point of view is suboptimal. So you'll lift less than somebody who can nail it. Like that's why hook grip slow-mo videos are so cool to see, because those like the Olympians who are winning gold medals in weightlifting, their bar path is so precise because that's what has to happen to lift maximally. You can't beat physics by being so brutally strong, because somebody with better bar path will be similarly strong, and it's like a lot easier to lift the same weight.
And I think if you really want to think about how close that margin is, I guess it wouldn't be far off. I'd say the width of your shoulder, because really once it's overhead, it's got such a small portion of it being placed over just essentially just like towards that mid back part of the head, that it's right over that straight line. It's so. And I think when there are, say, not as experienced trainees trying to do this, and this is coming from personal experience, so where you bang the bar, it was the CrossFit hump that you just smash the bar out, as you said, it would go flying out in front of you, because it means you've not got to move yourself out of the way, move your head out of the way as it's coming up, and potentially, and then if you put your head too fast forward, that's where you headbutt the bar and it goes wrong. So, but when you're really trying, especially with an empty barbell, it normally happens. But then when you're doing that thrusting one where it just goes away from you and you have to put the brakes on, if you're relatively quite tight through, say, the chest and say the upper back and that sort of area anyway, it might be a bit easier because to put the brakes on. But then I find it then goes into the traps, and you see the shoulders just roll forward, and then you're holding again. I've seen videos of myself do this. I just see the loading, and I'm just like, it now makes me feel sick, because all too often when that bar goes up overhead, because of say lack of range of motion in say shoulder joints, is then you just see their traps just take a massive loading and just roll forward, and just an arm slightly bent, just anything to keep it up overhead. And this is then where I think when we touched on earlier with the toes raised, is in just because your say snatch doesn't look like someone else's, because of where you're currently at, you have to you have to work in different constraints. So you have to work through different bits to get to say the same end goal, but we're just because it's more individual. And it's just overhead is just one of those positions because so many people are, I'd say I see so many people, as we know, tight chests, everything's like weaker upper backs, because obviously from being on their phones, being on their laptops, keep like always looking down. It's in just, we're getting into that real kyphotic state. And you then try and press a barbell up overhead with those tight shoulders is going to be interesting. Wanted to just now lastly move on to say total body, and because I think that's this one fascinates me, because when you see like gymnasts in particular, like they can take their bodies through, and yogis, is it like people that obviously practice yoga and stuff, they can go through such big ranges of motion. And I think it might be quite tricky, well, I would guess, for someone like that to maybe pinpoint hypermobility, because they are so say loose all over. But how would someone like that maybe identifies an issue, but then how to work with that? How do they then kind of like stiffen up their total body in a way?
Yeah, good question. I think this sort of relates to what to do about hypermobility. Generally speaking, these people typically know who they are because they have like a gymnastics or dance or yoga background, and people will probably tell them how flexible they are. They generally like stretching because they're good at it. And as always, they need to get clear on what their body is for, what they're using their body for. So if they've come from that background and they now want to do weightlifting or CrossFit or a strength sport, then being clear on what movement patterns they need to level up in is going to tell them how they need to condition their body for those movements, because some might be absolutely fine, some that huge flexibility will be a huge advantage, but that they then need to evaluate the risks that are facing them in those movements. So if it's a squat, do they just bottom out because they've got nothing decelerating them as they go into the bottom position? Is it when they're doing CrossFit and they're kipping, they just don't stop and they go through into this massive arch, so they're hyperextended almost on the global level? Like, getting clear on which movement patterns their hypermobility is a problem in, and then you can incorporate some specific protocols around how to tighten up the muscles that are loose, which should be decelerating them sooner. And how do you tighten them up? As we've discussed in the previous two examples, essentially you need to stretch and load that muscle to force it to fire. And this can be purely through load, or you can be smart using planes of motion. So understanding how to tweak an exercise to further lengthen the muscle, which means it will fire slightly sooner. And one of the coolest examples or techniques for achieving this effect as well is by making use of a phenomenon called co-contraction. I think we might have spoken about it before in a previous podcast, where essentially when your body detects instability, it will up-regulate tension to try and create the stability that's lacking. And the classic example of this is if you step onto an ice rink and you feel unstable, you naturally take much smaller steps, and that's your body automatically tightening up and not going into bigger ranges because it feels unsafe. So we're essentially using that principle to our advantage by using an unstable loading pattern to force the body to create its own stability. So this will be why some people feel better. So someone might get pain in a back squat, but no pain in an overhead squat. And that's a really good clue that the stability is helping them, or the extra instability is creating stability in their body, which means they actually feel better. And so doing like a single arm kettlebell overhead squat could be a way to teach the body to create stability sooner, because most people couldn't even get into that because they're too stiff. But somebody who's very mobile, that extra instability could cue the creation of stability, which then actually gets them to control the movement. And then beyond that, it's sort of classic principles of training, progressive overload. So how can we advance the exercise? And in those situations, we're actually making it harder for them by giving them less instability. So for them, the progressions are going from overhead squat to back squat, because back squat is a more stable loading pattern. So their body has to create the stability itself without that external instability to trigger so much co-contraction. And it's cool because it's the opposite to what most people think. Like, the other example of this is doing push-ups. Some people will find push-ups easier on 1 foot than on 2 feet because of the co-contraction creating trunk stability. And so for them, actually putting both feet on the ground is more difficult. And they're just quite cool examples of how traditional perceptions are reversed of what's harder and what's easier. It always depends. And for these hypermobile people, less stable variations are quite often more palatable.
Yeah, I really like that. And it just made me think, where using that squat analogy there, where a lot of the time when I'm with clients or whoever, and we're talking about, say, a back squat, and we're talking about creating tension, pulling the bar down into you, bracing and understanding that. But if you're in the other end of the spectrum, as I say, where you're hypermobile and you don't know what that bracing essentially feels like because you've never been asked to do that. Because if this is, as you said, having a weight on your back compared to overhead is a lot less demanding on, say, stability. So having that overhead position is essentially teaching you how to brace, and where it comes down to is, this is when we often talk about this as well, and it's just, it's going beyond just doing reps and just doing what we think it's supposed to look like, and actually feel the movement itself. Because I know we're both advocates of this, but I'm a big advocate of understanding, like, and always asking clients, where do you feel this? And is in like, and making them work hard to understand, like, what am I actually feeling? Like, yes, they're squatting or they're doing a deadlift. A Romanian deadlift is the prime example. I'm like saying, like, where do you feel this? Oh, I feel it in my back. Cool. Okay, then we know we're not doing it right yet. So and then we're coaching it through, and it's like, oh, it's now in my knees. It's like, okay, cool. Now we know there's going. So it's I've had to really take it on board, but with, like, say, swimming. So I had a swimming lesson yesterday, and I feel I've gone into it at, say, level 2, but I've missed that level 1. So I have no foundations. I don't understand how to do a lot of the basics, but I can kind of, because of my, say, technical proficiency in other things, I get away with a lot. So because I can muscle through things, the same as when I got into weightlifting, I was strong. So I was able to pull these weights up overhead, or I was able to just press them overhead. And then when I had to break it down and actually learn the technique side of it, so learning the foundations, it got me to understand the movement more. And that's then where using that squat and the overhead squat is, the overhead squat portion is really giving the individual an opportunity to learn what bracing feels like, what all these things, because they haven't had an opportunity to do it before. And I think, I've never even really thought of it like that to that point, because I'm just thinking, like, in my head, like, the bars on your back, load, brace, pull, is like, I know that feeling. So it's just like, cool, someone doesn't understand them bracing, but it's might not, they not understand it. It's just they can't get to that tension yet because where the loading is. So I've learned something today. Thank you very much. Well, I'm always learning, so I love it. But yeah, so have you got anything more to add to that?
I don't think so. I think that's plenty from me for today.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's all you're going to get for today. I'm going to charge for the rest. And one other thing, I just think that co-contraction thing, it just made me laugh, because I just thought about someone, as you say, like, on an ice rink, just like stiffened right up, and it just makes you think, like, I don't know, I think it was the Simpsons movie, or where Maggie's in like a star pajamas thing, and she's locked in this position, and I'm just picturing, like, being in an ice rink, just in a star position, just spinning around slowly because I can't stand still. So it's a funny thought, the co-contraction. But yeah, so cool. Well, I think we just want to definitely get some takeaways from this. Well, I hope you got some takeaways to the point of that hypermobility, I guess, is relatively common. It just you might not realize that you have it. So, but it's not necessarily an issue until it becomes an issue. Because I guess because that's the thing of understanding. I think where Ash mentioned earlier, knowing what you need to use your body for determines if it is an issue or not. Because you might be hypermobile, say in your elbow as an example, and you don't ever really press anything overhead consistently in weightlifting. So is it really an issue day to day? Probably not. It might be something you might want to look to strengthen, but it's not necessarily an issue. And I guess these type of things, I guess, are genetic. I guess they're genetic. Why can't I say genetic? Genetic. I'm saying it multiple times. Guess it comes from, like, being a child, and women, I guess, because they have more hormones, right? More estrogen.
Yeah, more. Yeah, flexibility is related to estrogen, and obviously during birth, relaxin is another hormone that gets secreted to. Which is why women who are postpartum need to be a little bit careful with how they train, because they'll have extra range of motion compared to what they had before. Yeah.
So, and then, as we said, if you want to learn a bit more or listen to a bit more in-depth stuff about, like, mobility and stability, check out podcast 10, where we went into a little bit more detail about this, because then obviously you can start to think about some of the bits that we discussed today, and then actually work out maybe it's a stability issue or mobility issue. So you start to think a little bit more than just giving it a blanket terminology. And so I think one other thing is it's the quality that can be trained, right? Loading is important to teach the development of tension. I read that off your notes.
Spot on, mate. Could have said it better myself.
I really do hope you pulled a lot of information from today. And as always, if you do have any questions, do shoot them across to us on Instagram or drop us an email. All links are in the description box down below. If you did enjoy this episode, or you know someone that is hypermobile and you think this will really benefit them, do share this with them. Share it through them either over social or send them as a shared link. That'd be really appreciative to help our podcast grow. But thanks a lot for giving us your time. We really do appreciate it. As always, you can leave us a review on iTunes. We really appreciate that. And give us a cheeky 5 stars there, and follow us on YouTube. And if you've got any questions, send us a question to contact@lungeandlift.com or slide in our DMs. But apart from that, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, guys.